In our second lecture of the Behavioral Sciences series, we're going to talk about sensation and perception. Sensation and perception are often used interchangeably, but in psychology, these are two very distinct things. Sensation is the conversion or transduction of physical, electromagnetic, auditory, or other information from the internal and external environment into electrical signals. These electrical signals are what our brain uses to process, which leads us to perception, which is the actual processing of this information to make sense of its significance. Now, we can get very metaphysical here, because one of the overarching questions in philosophy is whether or not our senses and our perceptions of these senses are accurate, but let's avoid that for now. So every sensation has to deal with a threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum stimulus energy that is needed to activate a sensory system. Anything below this won't cause a signal, so you won't sense it. The threshold of conscious perception is the stimulus energy that is needed to create a signal large enough in size and long enough in duration to be brought into awareness. That's not to say you don't sense it, it's just that you're not consciously aware of it. The difference threshold, or JND, is the minimum difference in magnitude between two stimuli before they can be perceived as different. And this would play into the Weber's law, which states that the JND for a stimulus is proportional to the magnitude of it. All this is really saying is that for a smaller, low magnitude stimulus, it takes less JND for you to notice distinctions. However, for a larger one, it will require an equally larger JND. The signal detection theory, it refers to the effect of non-sensory factors on the perception of stimulus. These non-sensory factors can be experiences, motives, expectations, or other extraneous factors. It's commonly called a response bias. An example of this is if you were to, say, be getting a dental operation done. If there was music playing in the background that you felt very emotionally attached to, the pain you feel in your mouth might be different because of it. Adaptation is the decrease in response to a stimulus over time. This is usually due to overexposure or prolonged stimulus. An example of this is if you had repeated exposure to a loud noise. Eventually, if that loud noise persisted, you would eventually figure out a way to block it out, and it'll kind of get drowned out, and you'll sort of start to ignore it. That's an adaptation. So now that we've talked about the basics of sensation and perception, let's go into some specific forms of senses. The first one is vision. Before we can go into vision, let's go ahead and talk about the structure of the eye, which is the primary sensory receptor for vision. The cornea gathers and filters incoming light. The iris divides the eye into the anterior and posterior chamber, and it opens and closes the pupil for using two muscles. The lens refracts and focuses light on the retina, and the retina itself is the actual area where you start to perceive sensory information. It contains rods and cones. Rods detect light and dark. Cones detect color. From the eye, it goes down a specific chain which eventually ends at the occipital lobe. The first part of the chain are the rods and cones, which then go to the bipolar cells, the ganglion cells, the optic nerve, and then finally the brain. At the bottom, there's a picture that shows this flow. So, as we stated before, color is detected by cones. There are other cells that help with your vision, though. Parvocellular cells perceive shape. Their spatial resolution is very good, but they have very low temporal resolution. Long story short, they're very good at perceiving stagnant details, but they're not particularly good at detecting motion. What are good at detecting motion are magnocellular cells. Although their spatial resolution is lower, their temporal resolution is very high. We do need both of these to see things the way we'd like to. The next sense we're going to go into are hearing and vestibular senses. The structure of the ear is comprised of three areas. The outer ear consists of the auricle, the external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane. The middle ear is the ossicles, malleus, incus, stapes, and the oval window. The inner ear is the bony labyrinth, the membranous labyrinth, the cochlea, the utricle, the saccule, and semicircular canals. The cochlea is the thing that perceives sound. It's shaped like a snail shell if you've seen it before. So let's go ahead and draw that out. As I stated, the cochlea looks like a snail shell. It looks kind of like this. Now, sound is going to go into one end and be detected by these hair-like structures that go down the cochlea. Depending on how far the sound travels, it will be at a certain frequency. So if the sound is at a specific frequency, it will stop at a certain part of the cochlea. These hair cells are what detect the sound and send that information to the brain. The vestibular sense is also inside the inner ear. It's comprised of the utricle and saccule and the semicircular canals. And both of those kind of help with our sense of balance and our motion. So the utricle and saccule detect linear acceleration, and that's denoted by this right here. It's full of fluid, and depending on how this fluid moves around, you'll feel whether or not your body's moving. The semicircular canals are up top here, and they detect rotational acceleration. They're also full of fluid, so as you move, this fluid sloshes around and gives you a sense of where you are in space. The auditory information flows from the cochlea to the auditory nerve, down the auditory pathways to the auditory cortex. This is all processed in the temporal lobe. Finally, let's get into some other senses. Smell is detected by olfactory chemoreceptors in your nose. It's processed by higher order brain areas like the limbic system. In English, this means that your senses, the things you smell, are going to be influenced by emotional factors, memories, and previous experiences. An example of this would be perfume. So, let's say your girlfriend wears a specific kind of perfume. And let's say you were to break up with said girlfriend. Well, if you were to smell that same perfume somewhere else, you'd be reminded of her. This is a way that the limbic system influences your sense of smell. You'll probably have a certain reaction to that perfume. Maybe nostalgia, maybe anger, maybe longing, who knows? This is an example of the signal detection theory at work. Non-sensory information has a huge impact on our perception of sense information. Although other senses are influenced by non-sensory information, smell in particular seems to be impacted very heavily. Pheromones are the chemicals given off by animals that have an effect on social foraging and sexual behavior on other animals of the same species. Now, it's up to debate whether or not humans have pheromones. If you can discover if we have them, though, you could probably make a lot of money off of it. Taste is another form of chemoreception, and it's based around your tongue, or more specifically, the taste buds on your papillae. There are 5 modalities: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, or savory. Your tongue is also capable of sensing water, but that's not particularly something you taste. Somatosensation is touch perception. It deals with pressure, vibration, pain, and temperature. These sensors are based around your dermis. The 2-point threshold is the minimum distance necessary between 2 points of stimulation to detect them from each other. So, if you felt 2 different points on your skin, How far apart they would have to be for you to sense them as different would be your 2-point threshold. Physiological zero is your normal skin temperature. Any object that is higher or lower in temperature is going to cause you to sense a distinction. An integral part of somatosensation is pain reception, which is carried out by nociceptors. Pain is the way that our body tells us whether something is wrong. Obviously, if you can't feel pain, this can lead to some serious problems. And people who have trouble feeling pain or have issues with their nociceptors tend to be in medically dangerous situations. For example, if I could not feel pain, I would not know that I was bleeding or that something was really hot. This can lead me to leave myself into a situation that I should generally recoil or deal with. The gate theory of pain largely states that pain sensation is reduced when other somatosensory information is present. An example of this would be, say, getting a tattoo. If the music was very soothing in the tattoo parlor, you might not be as aware of the pain you're feeling as the artist is hitting you with that needle. Proprioception is also called the kinesthetic sense. It's the ability to tell where one's body is in three-dimensional space. This is a combination of your vestibular sense and your somatosensation. They both work together to figure out where you are. If you're particularly athletic, you can say that you have a very good proprioception. We've gone through a lot of the basic senses that our body has, so let's move on to object recognition. When you're trying to recognize objects, you have different forms of processing. The first one is called data-driven processing, or bottom-up processing. This is the recognition of objects by parallel processing and feature detection. Your brain takes in individual information and combines it. It's slower, but it's less prone to error. Conceptually driven processing, on the other hand, or top-down processing, recognizes objects by memories and expectations. The brain quickly determines the object as a whole without analyzing each part. Let's have a quick look at how the two processes approach a newly observed object. Bottom-up processing relies on using small details. So if I found something that I've never seen before, I might take into account all of its individual parts, combine them, and then make a conclusion about what this object actually is. Again, this is much slower, but it's far more accurate. Top-down processing, on the other hand, pays little attention to detail, and it's faster, but it's more prone to error. This is because objects are generally clumped together and recognized by previous experiences. So, if I came across an object before that was similar to this new object, I might be inclined to just attribute this new object with that old object. It's faster, and I won't have to recognize the whole thing by its parts, but it's generally a huge assumption. Both of these processes are very important with object recognition, and there are pros and cons to both. Gestalt principles. These are the ways that your brain infers missing parts of a picture when it's incomplete. It's a way that your brain fills in the blanks. There's a lot of different rules and laws in the Gestalt principle, but let's just go over a couple really simple ones. The law of proximity states that when elements are close to another, they tend to be grouped together and perceived as a unit. For example, the circles in this line here. The law of similarity states that when objects look similar, they also tend to be grouped together. So that would be in the center here. The law of good continuation basically states that if it looks like they should be together, then they probably are. So if they're following the same pathway, they also tend to be grouped together. Closure and enclosure basically just states that if things are closed in or not closed in, we'll generally try to group them together as such. And finally, the law of connection states that when things are linked in a specific way, we will also tend to group them as a unit. There's a law that isn't listed here in the pictures, but it's also important, and that's the law of prognance. which states that perceptual organization will always be as regular, simple, and symmetric as possible. Basically, our brains really don't like overly complex concepts. So that'll do it for our discussion of sensation and perception. Please join us in the next lecture as we go over learning and memory.